with us in the past. We're going to record the session so that we can provide you it as an artifact and as a reference tool. As we go through the session today, feel free to use the chat first to put your name and your title and your school or your organization in so we can get a sense of who's with us today, and then to ask questions as we go through. We will try to monitor the chat as we go through the day and answer them, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. Before we dig in, I'm going to have our partners from the Workforce Skills Cabinet who have been working with us on CTI and are really the administrators of CTI. My colleagues from Cohort introduce themselves, so I'll pass it off. I guess I'll start with Anthony since he did a little warm up for the crowd.
Thanks, Bob. Hi, everyone. Anthony Britt, Director of Sector Strategies here at Commonwealth Corporation. Great to be with all of you today. I'll pass it over to Jess.
Morning, everyone. My name is Jess Sands. My pronouns are they and AJ, and I'm the Program Manager for the ComCore Career Technical Initiative. Welcome, welcome. Happy to have you.
Good morning, everyone. Teresa Rowland, Senior Vice President of Programs at Commonwealth Corporation. Good to see all of you and get to continue to work on this journey that we started about a year ago. I'm going to turn it over to our President and CEO, Christine Abrams, to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Christine Abrams, President and CEO of ComCore, and I am delighted to be on this call today and want to thank all of you for coming together in collaboration. This is such an important grant and aligns so well with the regional blueprints providing jobs and that provide equitable incomes for all. So it's important for us. It's important for us as a community. And I thank you for your interest, and I thank you for your partnership in making this grant and the jobs that are going to come with it a reality. And with that, turn it back to Bob.
So we're going to jump to the next slide. I should also recognize Olivia Arnold from Boston Consulting Group, who many of you were kind enough to spend time with, and her colleagues to provide interviews. I think as we go through the day and discuss where we're going with CTI, you're going to find that your counsel and advice is shining through in a number of areas. So on this slide, you're going to see these are our topics for the day. We're going to walk through the first topic on the current state of the workforce funding. Some of you may have seen this in other meetings, regional briefing sessions, or other meetings of some of this overview. But we're going to spend the bulk of the time specifically related to CTI and providing a deep dive on where we are and what we heard, what we learned, and where we've made adjustments to make this work as best as possible for you as providers and for students and employers as partners. There's a lot of information today, and we've been gathering it over a period of time. So in some cases, this is going to be a little bit of a refresher, and some of it will be new information. And again, feel free to use the chat as we go through the day, and we'll definitely have some times at the end for some brainstorming of questions of how we can provide more assistance. So I think we can jump to the next one. So the first start is going to just go with a quick overview of the funding. I know, again, some of you have seen this, but we just want to give you a context of where the funding is coming from, what it's looking, what size and scope, and some context relative to other areas that are complementary to CTI. So again, a context where we sit as of today through the left, the American Rescue Act plan, the ARPA. These are dollars that have already been allocated. These are not part of the bigger legislative bill that is out there being worked on now. These are dollars that are in hand from early set aside for the governor that are committed to providing capacity and capabilities for workforce training. $50 million on the left. As noted there, we also are continuing to have dialogues about the larger ARPA bill and additional funding. I just point out that the ARPA bill, as noted on the bottom, has a longer timeline than annual appropriations, which will give us some flexibility and thinking about multi-year strategies. On the right is the Commonwealth budget, a total of workforce dollars, much larger than many of you know we've ever had, 54 million. It is a multiple of 4 in competitive trust increase and a multiple of 5 of what was available in career tech funding in 21. So the messaging here is our strategies are about driving scope and regional participation and driving scale and thinking about strategic multi-year investments. I think very aligned to past dialogues. So we're in a very unique place where we think we can impact a lot of employers and a lot of individuals and invest these dollars wisely and well to change communities. So we'll jump to the next slide. Some of you have, again, seen this slide on upcoming funding, and this is really a deep dive on some of the things we've talked about, and we're going to move into some of these in a little bit more depth as we go through the day, particularly the ones on the right. But we just wanted to highlight, we're going to talk about CTI and in particular the occupations related to CTI. I do want to use this as an opportunity to note the occupations that are in demand in part of regional blueprints that are not CTI occupations. They are not the skilled trades, manufacturing related occupations defined as funding through career tech, can be funded through Workforce Competitive Trust Fund. So an example of that based on some previous calls might be something like in the healthcare or the IT space, where some of the providers who are on the call today, some of the schools on the call today might be interested in being a training provider. I also want to highlight something new called Renew, which is focused on a demonstration project, and that application is currently posted, but it's a partnering agreement between an employer and the training provider where the partnering employer pays back a portion of the cost, 50% of the training cost. And essentially what happens there is you're creating a little bit of a sustainable funding model where we can build a partnership over a time between a co-investment between the employer and the state so that we can get more leveraging on our dollars and they can have a more consistent flow of individuals. So if you're interested in that, you can find that RFP on the ComCore website under funding opportunities. We'll talk about the planning, the navigators, the market makers, and marketing campaigns as we go through the process today. So I'll spend a little bit more time on future slides related to those. Again, just as we go through, we want to highlight the potential of CTI and the volume, and we'll talk in more depth about the specific timelines on when grants have been posted and when they'll be available, particularly the planning grant and the upcoming implementation grant. And Anthony, who is on top of it as always, has put the link to the ComCore website and available funding into the chat to help you. And I'm sure we'll follow up with it on the slides or in upcoming emails. Before we jump to the next section on CTI, any questions? I don't see any in the chat, but anything that you want to talk about relative to the general size and scope of where the skills cabinet is going? Otherwise, I'll jump over to CTI and talk about the specifics of where we're going with that. So I'll let the chat open for a couple of seconds here, a couple minutes, see if anybody has any general questions. I don't see any, so we're going to move on. I'm going to give it a little extra time because I know some people might be a bad typer like me, so we'll give a little extra time and then we'll just jump forward. So Dave Godera has a question about the relationship between the navigator and the market makers. We're going to talk about that as we go through. But the general is the role of the market maker is helping to facilitate regional collaboration between the providers and the employers. And the role of The navigator is to support individuals who are interested in enrolling and participating in training programs in the region, inclusive of CTI and other skills cabinet funded types of training programs, and assisting in the placement of students into employers. So complementary relationships, but we'll do a little deeper dive, Dave, as we go through the process today. So let's jump over to the deep dive on CTI, I think. So as we look at this side, a couple of important parts to this. Again, I just want to do a little framing on CTI because many of you have been engaged in the dialogue about CTI over the last 3 or 4 years. And just before we jump relative to the specifics of third shift program, I just want to frame this. As you all know, relative to our regional blueprints over the last 4 or 5 years in our WIOA work, we identified key occupations, many of which are part of the CTI initiative, where there were significant regional and statewide skill gaps, and the number of individuals who had access to these types of training programs so they could come in and fill the roles needed by employers. The Skills Cabinet has worked on this as a multi-part strategy under the Career Tech Initiative, focused on building training capacity for these, which means we've been working on strategic growth of our traditional vocational day programs, our Chapter 74 programs. As many of you may be partnering in your region, we also created an opportunity that we deem second shift, that is focused on high school students who may not be enrolled in a Chapter 74 vocational program traditionally, from a sending high school, who can participate in an afternoon program in a strategy to get the credentialing that other Chapter 74 students would get in their normal day schedule. And then the third part was, how do we activate the facilities and leverage the talent from an instructional standpoint to provide access for adults? And that's really our focus today, that third shift after dark. But again, I wanted to frame this. This is part of a bigger initiative to provide access. Couple key parts to this is the focus on unemployed and underemployed. Anthony's going to talk about some of those measures as we go through them. And certainly we're defining the underemployed workers at 60% or less of median income. And we will provide you some resource charts by region so that you can identify what that may be. We're certainly focused on in-demand industries and occupations. As we talk about those occupations, I know some people have seen them in the past. We're going to provide the list because it's been updated based on information from the field and labor market study information. Again, the third shift is leveraging the expertise of our high schools who have designated aligned Chapter 74 programs. The basics of that is, if you want to provide the adult programs, then you have to have the corresponding day program. And that's to ensure that the facilities meet industry standards, they meet safety guidelines, and that there's instructional awareness and capacity at the school relative to that specific vocational training area. So we can move to the next slide. Here is just a little bit of program requirements. And this is, again, as you are thinking about participating in CTI, and we'll start on occupations and the running cohorts and discuss the target populations. But just the overall framing is, it's in scope occupations and pathway requirements that we are consistent in the targeted population and eligibility requirements as we do a deep dive. We're going to try to provide deeper clarity on how to work with partners and outline those responsibilities. And we're going to talk about the funding and reporting requirements. And this is really the meat of the discussion today, because this is where you're going to see some of the impact of your participation and feedback on what we've done in the last year and how we can make it more accessible, easier to navigate, and support scaling across the Commonwealth. So as I mentioned, we, based on feedback from the field and labor market information provided directly from our blueprints, our updated blueprints, and what we've heard from employers of the demand and need, you see the original list plus 3 additional pathways that have been requested by employers and looking at labor market and in demand jobs. So you're going to see the addition of automotive body repairs, and those programs being an option for the potential development of a program. That would also be called automotive collision in Chapter 74 lingo. You're going to see the addition of horticulture. We are defining that to the occupations of groundskeeping and equipment operators. We certainly heard that very robustly this summer. And then you're also going to see the addition of culinary arts / cooks. That was one that with the field we had discussions 2 years ago, but when COVID early impact happened, we found that there were many, at least initially, unemployed cooks. But then over a period of time, particularly as we rolled through the summer, we found that employers in the hospitality industry are having a very difficult time finding cooks and have been requesting the opportunity to be part of CTI. So again, those are a little bit looser in skilled trades, but they're all Chapter 74 aligned programs. Again, I want to highlight, if there are occupations that you're interested in that are not on these 2 lists and part of CTI, it doesn't mean that there isn't training resources available. It just means those aren't through CTI. They may be through another vehicle like the Workforce Training Fund that I mentioned earlier. So we can jump to the next. As you're thinking about it, there are 5 requirements that are really at the heart of this. And there's a couple that I want to make sure that we get clarity on, because they've been misunderstood or misaligned a little bit with the field. As I noted earlier, the program must be designated as a Chapter 74 vocational program aligned to the occupation, right? There needs to be clarity on that. Yes, we do check with our colleagues at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to make sure that you're in good standing. We're looking for our partners to provide training programs for a minimum of 2 occupations. So 2 of those occupations out of the 20 at minimum, related to your 74 program capacity. We are focused on providing at least 1 cohort for each of those occupations and not more than 6 cohorts per occupational program. We're focused on a course class size of 10 students per cohort on average. As we develop this strategy, we know, and we'll talk about recruitment, and we recognize that recruitment and partnering to attract employers and to attract students is going to be a key part of this work. The overall total instructional hours for the training program should be a minimum of 200 hours and a maximum of 300 hours. We'll be able to share some of the past practices where schools have already been providing training programs to give you some guidance on what other people have done historically. We'll also be able to give you some sense of the types of certifications that they've embedded or industry credentials that they've embedded in their training programs. And again, we're focused on those credentials that are going to provide access immediately into those targeted occupations. And those, again, could be industry-related credentials, state licensure credentials, or federal licensure credentials. Could also be apprentice hours and related instruction in an apprentice hours. So we'll have a little bit of deeper dives. One thing that I do want to talk about at this point, just to again reflect on some of the dialogues, is as you think about structuring of your training program and how you're going to be able to provide it, I just want to have clarity that while we're using the Chapter 74 status as a proxy of qualification, we do not require that your instructors are Chapter 74 day instructors. They don't have to meet the state licensure guide. These were after subject matter experts. So you can use an industry expert who has proper credentialing i.e. the industry credentialing or the experience demonstrated in the field. You can use multiple instructors. And in fact, we found from our work with other types of training programs that within your 200 to 300 hours, you can carve out portions for different instructors. That will allow you to leverage multiple people and fill different roles and serve different expertise. But again, you do not have to have your day instructor be doing all 300 hours or all 200 hours of the program. They certainly can play a role as appropriate. And depending on your program design, you can also do team teaching or facilitated teaching with instructors as well. Any questions on that framing on the general top 5 key requirements for the program? This is like a Friday afternoon class when I was a professor years ago. I'm either doing a really good job or everybody didn't have enough coffee. I'm guessing the coffee, to be honest with you. I'll give it a couple more seconds, then we'll move on. All right, we'll move on. I'll consider that a success. I'm going to jump to the next slide.
I'm Mary Saris. I just came up with a question that I was trying to formulate. It does appear that these CTI programs do not have to be Section 30 eligible. Is that correct?
That's going to be up to the program design of the individual school and the individual program. We certainly would advocate that they are designed as such, Mary, but it is going to be up to the design of the school. It's not a requirement.
Thank you.
And that was a great question, Mary. And I should note, for those people who aren't familiar with those requirements, they really should be, again, as they're collaborating with their local mass hire and their local career centers. That's where the program design elements are so important, because we want as many individuals to be eligible to participate as possible.
Correct. Right.
I think Aaron had a question.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, Bob, but just about how many weeks have you seen these courses run over? You mentioned the 200 to 300 hours.
I would say predominantly between 12 and 18 weeks. We want enough density each week so that you have an impact, but we recognize adult scheduling can be difficult. I should know where we call these third shift. We have flexibility in when the third shift starts, just like employers. These certainly could start from a late afternoon strategy into the early evening. You have the flexibility of doing these on whatever consecutive days that you choose. And you certainly could consider strategies, if it was appropriate, to use a Saturday training class or course. That's where some people can get a little bit more density, where they might be able to say, I'm going to do 4 or 6 hours so I can do the equivalent of a more intensive shop experience, Aaron, in a program design. So again, we recognize each school has to balance facility usage, but you have strong flexibility in that. We think if you get too long in programs, and I know I'm kind of preaching to a choir of experts, but the longer you get in total number of weeks, the more difficult persistence and recruitment gets. So that's kind of the sweet spot. I should have also noted, as you're thinking about hours in your cohorts, they don't have to be the same for each cohort. Let's say an example would be, you want to do something in carpentry. You might look and say, I want that program to run from late fall into early spring, because then in early spring, the carpenters tend to hire. So you can adjust the length of the individual training program or cohort to be reflective of employer need and demand and student need and demand. I did a little hand visual there, but I'm not sure it worked. Aaron gave me a thumbs up, so I'll take that as a solid B.
That was great. I would give it an A- at least.
You're a very generous man. Any other questions before we jump to the next? All right, let's jump to the next. So this is, I'm gonna do this one jointly with Anthony as we did in the past, because I think he has a little bit more expertise. Again, what we wanted to do here is just get a framing. This was a question in the calls with the field, and has historically been something I think Jess, as interacting with the schools and the program coordination role, has found to be a constant dialogue. So we wanted to give you a framing of the data that's out there. This is the 60%. What you see, for example, I'm gonna use Hampshire County on the bottom of the slide. That's the 60% is the number reflective there. So 44.5 is 60% of the median income. And I'm gonna look to my friend Anthony, make sure I frame that the right way. And that's what you would use as the guidance post to evaluate eligibility. And that's at the individual level, not the household level. And I'm gonna just, again, look to Anthony to make sure that I'm right or wrong on that, because I think it's a real key point here.
So yeah, so in Bob's example, the chart, absolutely, Hampshire County would be 44,500 individual level for those who are underemployed based on their county of residence, the individual's county, like Bob said.
So again, you're using that as a proxy to assess eligibilities. In part, well, we're using both state legislated dollars that we have for support of CTI. We also will be using ARPA dollars, so we want to be consistent and have the proper proxy as we think about eligibility and impact. We feel that this 60%, which is used in other areas, really will give you a very wide pool to draw from. I should note at this time that, and we'll talk about it as we go forward, this is for people that are being funded directly by state dollars through CTI. You could enroll a few additional people that are not covered by this grant in the training program. We're going to talk about that because it is a question that's come up by the field. Jennifer Shea has a question. I'm going to read it for Anthony, right? This is facilitator option. To clarify, a recent high school grad living at home but earning less than a median income can be served. My answer to that is yes, because they have personal income less than $44,500 if that individual is living in Hampshire County. So yes, you could build a strategy for recent high school graduates as a targeted population. And they don't have to have been historically full-time employed, because I think that has come up as a question for somebody at one point. Did that do it for you, Jennifer?
Could you speak to Doreen's question regarding the documentation required for proof of income?
It will be self-attestation. And it will be part of the materials in onboarding process, and we'll be able to give you some examples of what people have used in the past. And I think Jennifer is good as well. So we will jump to the next slide. I know that this is just refreshing on eligibility. I know that in the past calls, people have heard some of this, but I think it's just really, really important to focus on the strategy of partnerships, both on a regional basis as you're thinking about how you develop strategies, inclusive of thinking of having dialogue with your partners in your career centers, your workforce boards, and other providers of Chapter 74 program, thinking about how you align scheduling so that you can be complementary, not necessarily competitive, making sure that you're not necessarily all doing the same thing on the same day, the same way. Also thinking about the specific roles. We'll come back to that question on households. I see that Linda put in there. We'll come back to that in just a second. Certainly your required partners as we go through it are going to be the workforce board the career centers and to employers. And I heard somebody for a second. The key to the two employers is, again, we want to have placement of students into opportunities for immediate employers. So we're looking for the employer partners to play a role from the beginning, to be visible, to assist in showing that there are employers who are interested in hiring. We certainly want employers to give feedback on curriculum and making sure the industry credentials are aligned to their hiring practices. And then, as I noted, we also want to make sure that employers are part of the discussion, thinking about hiring timelines and hiring cycles. Certainly, this part of this dialogue is, again, happening through the regional blueprint teams, thinking about regional impact and regional scale. And so I know that you're going to be engaged through those regional teams and through the navigators to think about coordinating and building a complementary regional system. And I think I'll jump to the, I'll go back to the two questions. What about a head of household with family members? Are they eligible? Are they able to earn more? If yes, how would that be calculated? My understanding, again, and Anthony is the expert, is it's individual income, not household income. So it would be, what is the income of that individual, not the inclusive of a proxy of using any kind of formula-driven approach of number of people in the household or accumulation of multiple salaries within the high school. It's the household. It's very specific to that one individual. Anthony's shaking his head, so I'll take that. Yes, I've been well schooled. Is the income eligibility an ARPA requirement or a state requirement for state funds? Both. It's a both and. It's a both and. So everything that will go through this is aligning both the ARPA practices as well as state practices. I think we can jump to the next slide. Slide 12. Here are the requirements of a lead applicant. I'm not going to go through them exhaustively. As I've mentioned, that the key to this is partnering and having all the elements together. The key ones are the contracting eventually will be deployed through Commonwealth corporations. You do have to have an MOU with the Mass Hire and Career Centers, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The applicant certainly has to communicate their recruitment strategy, their eligibility strategy, their timelines, how they're going to be able to do enrollment decisions, how they're going to recruit, assess, and screen participants. They're going to be able to look and talk about, again, confirming that they're going to be coordinating. What's the elements of the instructions look like, what's hands-on, what's related instruction, being able to have clarity on something that I know that you're all very familiar with, is making sure that you're incorporating proper social distancing and aligning to state recommendations in those areas. Certainly the training programs should incorporate workforce ready and job search, because the goal is that these individuals are ready to be fully employed. Certainly the lead applicant is responsible for data. We'll talk about that a little bit in depth as we go forward. And they will be playing the role ensuring and partnering to ensure that students are placed into employment. And Anthony will talk about it, but then they are also going to be responsible for submitting invoices to Commonwealth Corporation for reimbursement of costs associated with deploying the program. So again, that's just a quick inventory of what are the requirements of the lead applicant. Let's jump to the next. Here are the responsibilities of the career centers and partnerships. This is where we're going to really want to make sure people are understanding. As you're submitting your application, you need to identify the career center or centers, because we recognize that some training providers geographically can be literally between two centers. They may be working with one or multiple, or maybe three, I guess, but a minimum of one of the career centers that they're going to be working with. The key point of this is it should be a very active discussion and partnership between the Career Center and the schools over the coming weeks and months. So planning and implementing, particularly in thinking about the timelines for planning grants and implementation grants, because both partners have to be ready to move forward in the Career Tech Initiative. As FTE capacity is increased at mass hire, schools should continue to engage those mass hire partners on demand to determine cohorts, timelines, and pathways. So part of what's happening with our partnership in the Skills Cabinet, and particularly with our colleagues at the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development, is the deployment of navigators and market makers. And so I know some of you are more familiar with this dialogue than others, but here is the general strategy. We recognize that recruitment of individuals into these training programs is a challenge and an opportunity. And the Skills Cabinet, through resources, is investing in every career center as a starting point, at minimum, to provide an FTE to facilitate partnering and recruitment of individuals for these programs. The program applicant, the lead applicant, should also be participating in getting referrals and recruiting. It's not solely the responsibility of the Career Center. It's a joint responsibility. They should be coordinating those activities. We really feel that investment is a wise investment by the Skills Cabinet to recognize the need for capacity and to simplify the process a little bit, because we'll fund those directly, which will reduce the need to have a joint funding application that we'll talk about as we go through this. But it will mean that the navigators are being built for capacity as a strategy. We will be also funding through the Skills Cabinet directly in each of those 7 regions as a starting point, a market maker. That staff member is going to be focused on engaging employers to hire people who are coming out of training programs, to be able to provide feedback on, for example, the demand for employers, the timeline for employers, how employers could participate in the training programs. Again, this is an opportunity to build out employer partnerships with new partners, but also help to engage existing partners. We recognize that our vocational schools, in many cases, in all cases, I should say, have advisory boards for that specific occupation, many of whom are thirsting for talent. And the school itself should be engaging its continued partnership of employers. The goal is the market makers can help engage and expand employer participation. The key to all of this is employer engagement, because we want those students who are going to invest the time to make sure that there's opportunities for them to be employed and fully qualified to be employed when they're completed. Again, this is a strategy that we think is simplifying the process. Certainly is based on what we've gotten from feedback from our career centers, our workforce boards, and our providers of the need of staffing capacity to make this happen, particularly as we drive scales in multiple program areas and cohorts. It's going to take a little bit of time, the next few months, to get these positions in place, but we want you to know that they're coming and they're in active dialogue to be prepared to support you. We really feel that this is something that the Skills Cabinet and the secretaries are very passionate about, that we have the proper support to be able to make this happen for students and to happen for employers. So again, that was based on the feedback, and it really reflects what we've done in some other areas relative to manufacturing and healthcare to start to build some regional capacity. Before I turn it over to Anthony, any questions that I can answer? And I'd certainly like Anthony and advocate for Anthony to jump in, but I'm going to turn it over to him for the next slide. He's going to talk a little bit deeper about funding and funding timelines.
Bob, can you just clarify what Section 30 is? I wasn't familiar with that question earlier on.
So section 30 is an eligibility requirement to receive housing vouchers, and also is served sometimes as a proxy and alignment for childcare vouchers. So as you're thinking about strategies, that's a really good question. As you're thinking, Tony, about strategies, you want, as Mary is such a passionate advocate, particularly as we've talked about people in manufacturing, you want to develop a program to be deployed at your school that unlocks the potential for as many people to participate and to have proper support. So I'm going to give an example, and I saw my friend Larry Martin put an email, but he knows that Bob LePage long ago, without Larry's wisdom, was working on a designing of a program under a grant, and it wouldn't have fit section 30 and other eligibility guidelines. And really what would have happened was those that are mostly unemployed and underemployed that we would have been tracked, we're looking to attract to the program, a significant portion of them wouldn't have been able to have the family sustainability resources that they needed to participate in the program. So that's why you want to sit down with your mass hire partners and think about intentional design. And it's very often aligned to the specific number of hours. I think it's, Larry can correct me because he's done it for a decade. Is it 17 and a half hours?
It's 17 and a half to 20.
At least that was on the
17 and
low
a
end.
half, 17 and a half minimum, 20 hours, basically to round the number up.
Right. So again, we're the braid, that's almost like a braiding strategy, is you want to leverage those other resources, and then CTI will cover the cost of training. And within your CTI budget, certainly you can, and I don't want to step on Anthony's work, but that's where thinking about how you're using your investment per student and what resources you might provide and from where, things like bus passing that Larry and I worked on historically, or you know, something like materials and startup kits. That's where, again, as you think about your budget on it on a program by program basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Anthony in my scrolling. I think there might have been one chat question I missed.
Bob?
Yep.
Sorry, before you turn it over, that's a question. What are the career centers assessing, and are there specific tools that we will be required to use as part of that assessment?
So really the career assessments are assessing eligibility and recommending, are they meeting the baseline eligibility? Relative to the next steps, Kevin, that's a really good question. That's going to be related to the program design. As you know, different occupations might have different program requirements or eligibility requirements. So some licensed occupations, for example, might require a high school credential. So you would want to be able to tell the individual, if you want to be in this, you have to have a high school credential. So this occupational training program may not be for you, but this other one does not require a high school credential. So that would be an example. On a local basis, as you're thinking about program quality and program instruction, that's where a dialogue of, do you want to assess something like math abilities on the front end? It's not going to be a state requirement on a program eligibility, but it should be part of the program design. Certainly my own experience also might be, you might want to do something to assess basic language abilities as well. And certainly I think, again, working with you and others in Hampden County historically, people have done things like Bennett Mechanical as a pre-assessment. So it's really to look at ensuring that that student will be prepared to be successful. And again, I want to note that as a program provider, it's really important that you're thinking about how that relates to each specific program. Because what may be required in program X may not be the same as program Y. And so as you're thinking about your occupations and where you're going to start with, you want to be conscious of that. And it is part of thinking about the program application. It will guide you with some narrative questions related to that. And just before I turn it over to Anthony, the other part I should note about this is what we're looking for is the starting point with schools, and recognizing that this is, the goal is to grow capacity over a period of time. And so using Kevin's question and Larry's observations and a couple other people's observations, you should look for the programs that you're comfortable of getting started with. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have opportunities down the road to change or add additional programmatic areas, right? So those that may be more complicated to get started, you may want to wait till later in your grant, where you might want to wait to the next grant cycle to be considered for those, because you are going to have multiple opportunities for funding. But again, that's sitting down with your partners and thinking about, how do you want to assess this? How do you want to look at it? We can point to tools, but we're not prescribing tools.
Bob, I had a quick eligibility question.
Sure.
Since this is braided funding somewhat between ARPA and state level funding, is there a requirement that participants need to meet the draft registration requirement?
We have not been told that as a requirement for the federal dollars, Larry. And we have not been told that for the state dollars. I surfaced that question a little while back on a national level. I emailed a couple people to see if they were finding that language anywhere in ARPA. As you know, that has historically been a Pell eligibility requirement, but I have not seen it from a eligibility for ARPA funding requirement.
Okay, and I have another question, and it's somewhat related to the conversation that David had started, and it's I lost my train of thought. We'll move on. Oh, the navigator. You mentioned that the navigator may be utilized for other workforce skills cabinet initiatives. So will they be able to support the MTC manufacturing training programs?
They should be aware of all of the training programs that are being facilitated through Workforce Training Fund. I mean, Workforce Skills Cabinet, whether it's healthcare related programs, IT programs, manufacturing related programs. They should be aware and able to facilitate enrollment in any of those programs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the goal is for them to play a primary role in CTI, but also to be supportive of that. And part of what we're going to have to gauge over a period of time that we've been discussing at the senior staff level and with the secretaries is, as this scales up, what's the real requirement on staffing? Are we going to need more navigators? Certainly, as you think about a continuum of some of the opportunities and dollars that we may have to invest, I personally, and I can be reflective on my colleagues, don't believe that we can get to scale solely on one navigator in each career center. I think it's going to take wider footprint and a longer footprint to be able to get to scale. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
It was. Thank you, Bob.
Bob, if I could just follow up, kind of Larry just raised something in my mind here. For healthcare training, is there going to be a requirement that people be vaccinated for COVID? Because we're beginning to see this kind of bubble up in WIOA training, where people want to go for a healthcare profession, but are indicating they don't want to get a vaccination, which is a requirement of the healthcare industry.
We have not had a specific dialogue about that, Kevin, yet. Is really, at least on the first step, which is what are the local requirements of the school, and their policies will be their decision as a provider. At a state level, we have not had any discussion about specific requirements of vaccination. I would agree with you that there are occupations, predominantly in healthcare, where employment is going to require vaccination. So students certainly need to be informed of that on the front end, just like having a high school credential for eligibility or having a CORI or a SORI consideration for eligibility. We have not had any dialogue about requirement of vaccinations on the front end or documentation of vaccinations. And again, healthcare is outside of the scope of CTI, so that's kind of a different discussion, but I will raise that with our team about where that may come down.
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about down the road here as we roll out.
Yep.
Thank you.
Let me get over to Anthony because I know you guys want to know about how the funding has been. We've used our counsel and advice to update the funding model and what the funding timelines will look like.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bob, for kicking us off. And also I want to note a lot of great activity in the chat. There's, I think, one question Jared will come back to as we talk about getting to this funding and reporting requirements piece. And also, just around the Section 30 conversation we're having, there is some clarification in the chat around, Section 30 being a DUA training requirement to continue receiving unemployment insurance while not actively looking for work. And to Bob's point there, that's one of the, we added some links in terms of the nuance there, but it's one of those features that, by having a Section 30 waiver for the training, or for individuals, it does help to, we found that it does help to incentivize people, it helps with recruitment, so to speak, and to maximize the cost of training, since individuals are able to kind of stay whole in terms of their UI benefits or assistance while being in training. So a note there, and then I'll come back to Jared's question. So in terms of funding, how is this funding working and reporting requirements? So we want to provide just a high-level overview of this funding before jumping into the actual grant opportunities that are available this fall. So as Bob prefaced, one major change that we've made from previous funding rounds is that CTI is operating on a cost reimbursement basis. As it says here, payments managed on a cohort cost reimbursement and performance, with schools receiving funds in net 30 days from invoice submission of complete submission of invoices. And so what that just means for those of you who have been involved with CTI so far is that we have moved away from the performance-based funding model that was based on individuals. This doesn't mean that we're not tracking metrics and evaluation. We're still continuing to do that. And as you'll see, schools are still expected to report on performance metrics. We're still looking at enrollments and completions and job placements with 30-day retention to continue running cohorts and receiving funds. We're just changing the way that the costs, the budgets are created. So we're looking at all program related costs are allowable. Additional information is available in the actual implementation RFR. Schools can receive up to $6,000 per student. That's the cap there. In addition to that, $40,000 in startup funds in the first implementation grant, and that's to support the beginning cohorts. So that's all going to be more in detail in the RFR that's posted today. But this is just a preface of what you can expect for schools that have not applied yet for a CTI implementation grant. And this is similar to, for those of you who are familiar with the Workforce Competitiveness Trust Fund or Donnelly grants, this is similar to that model. There's a question about are pay stubs required to prove 30-day retention, or does a conversation with the student suffice? So this is one change where conversation with students will suffice, and more details in the implementation plan and in the actual grant agreements that you'll have with Commonwealth Corporation. But this is a shift which we hope will help with additional, verifying placements and getting info and cutting down on some of the back and forth in terms of follow-up and documentation. I think that was it. And then Alice just added some additional context around Section 30 waivers, noting that it's only while in training. And just to reiterate what she said here is that she's saying, to be clear, if the claimant wants the waiver, the training provider would need approval from DUA, and the extension of UI is up to 26 weeks or until training ends. So those are some of the details that are important, and through the planning process are details that we would work through. So I'm going to move to the next slide, but before we jump into the specific grant opportunities, that we have available. Want to see if there was any kind of additional questions that have come up so far for Bob and myself and the team.
Anthony, hi, Tammy from Pittsfield.
Hi, Tammy.
Is the 40K for startup cost in addition to the 6K reimbursement, or is that part of?
Yes. So that's in addition. Great question. So the startup funds, the $40,000 are in addition to the 6K per student. And startup funds are available for schools who have not already had implementation grants and access those funds.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anthony, I had a question regarding program retention. If a student makes it past 30 days in the training program itself, will the schools be allowed to bill for that person? So for instance, if a student, sometimes we lose students, and if the student makes it in a 300-hour program, they make it to hour number 75 and they drop for some reason, usually section 30. Can they still be billed? Can the school bill for that student? What's the threshold for that?
Yep. It's a great tie-in. The section 30 part, Larry. And yes, so that is one shift in that through this cost reimbursement funding model, students would be able to be billed towards the grant. We are setting performance thresholds, but we recognize that schools aren't going to get 100% retention throughout the program and aren't going to get to 100% of job placements either. So we, as a baseline so far in terms of CTI programs, we've had it's been 75% of attendance through the first 2 weeks of training. Schools can certainly adjust that based on the local decision. But once what we go with is that once students are considered, participants are considered enrolled by the program, at that point you can start billing for them. And we aren't going to reduce funding if 80% of students make it through to graduating from the program or completing the program.
Okay,
so that's one of the differences. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions before I keep it moving to the next slide? Great, so I think we can continue. So what you see here on this slide are the 3 different CTI funding opportunities that are being offered starting back in October 2021 through January of 2022. So we've had one opportunity released in October, and then we have one that was already released and then one that's being released today. So I want to quickly go through the information that you see on the left-hand side. This is only for, so not everyone who's on this call might have been aware of this, but just wanted to note that the round 4 implementation grant, that's for a January 2022 start, was only for schools that received our first round of planning grants. So it's not going to be applicable to most of the schools on the call. But we want to make sure, if you're not already, for workforce boards and career centers supporting schools and any sort of planning efforts, that you are just aware that this is happening. The RFR is due today. But again, it's only for those 6 schools that we had that were already in implementation. And some of them may have decided to wait for a future implementation date. So we will know that as of 5 o'clock today. The other opportunities we wanted to highlight here are available to all schools. So we released a planning grant that's due in 2 weeks. That's December 15th. This is the opportunity that we alluded to earlier for about 2 to 3 months of planning time, for in advance of an implementation application in the spring. So we can, in the slides that you received beforehand and then the ones that we'll send out afterwards, there's additional details on what happens in the planning grants. But we see this is structured as an opportunity to build relationships with employers and, to Bob's point earlier, thinking about aligning cohort dates, for example, understanding what exactly are the needs, and not really redesigning curricula, but adjusting as needed for the adult population, understanding kind of some of the baseline features of how to stand up the program for implementation. In addition, all schools are also eligible to apply directly for implementation funds. If the caveat there, if schools are ready to provide training as early as this spring or summer, we'd recommend applying for this opportunity, which we'll go into a little bit more. On the next page, we'll discuss how you might decide whether to do a planning grant first or an implementation grant. We are providing these different opportunities because we want to see more schools coming online as career technical institutes, and see more of those 20 occupations being offered across the Commonwealth. But we also recognize, especially in these times, the importance of being able to plan with partners and support alignment. And so those are some of the pieces that we'll talk through. And so again, that would be the implementation grant that's launching today. You'll see on that available funding page that I launched later this afternoon, and that is due January 14th. And let's see, any other questions? Yep, great, thanks, Bob. So on the next slide, so these are a couple guiding questions just to help schools, to help you determine whether it makes sense to jump into an implementation grant or start with a planning grant. You'll see there, 10 different questions, kind of, you don't have to check off all the boxes here, but we recommend that if you're able to say yes to those top 5 questions, that likely you're ready to apply for a CTI grant. If not, for example, if you're not currently marketing and providing these post-secondary adult training engagement programs, or don't already have experience developing and providing workforce industry credential training programs, those are something where we think that the planning grant would be beneficial to getting started. Again, we're providing different opportunities. So if you're able to, thinking about an occupation or two that you're able to, think you'd be able to run starting in the spring, then applying for an implementation grant might be the right step. So this also is, we hope, a good guide for schools thinking about what questions do you want to discuss with partners for the future, thinking about planning as you continue to expand the offerings provided through CTI. These questions are, again, going to be provided in the follow-up materials, as well as there's a page in the RFR for implementation that kind of provides additional context around planning grants and implementation opportunities. And then when we think about what the actual applications require, we've aimed to balance application that is both comprehensive but straightforward enough to complete, again, in partnership, but with the schools as the main, vocational schools as the main lead applicant. So just going to outline kind of 3 things that are required in the application for both planning and implementation grants. Require a narrative form that's no more than 3 written pages, so relatively short. This also includes a program budget form that outlines the number of cohorts that are being offered, roughly the timeline there, and how many people per cohort. We are requiring letters of commitment. Those don't need to be full-fledged MOUs with Mass Hire, for example, but just we were looking to see that there's level of commitment locally to participate and support these programs. Again, these items are spelled out in more detail on the request for responses, the RFR, but we wanted to highlight a number of those today on this call and see if there are any initial questions before we launch the application. for implementation. I think otherwise on that, yeah, I think that's it on this one. Any other, yeah, we'll jump over to Jess for any kind of questions the group has on CTI at this point. So Jess, I'll pass it to you.
So much. About to have a little question and answer session, or some time to decompress or come up with some questions for CTI related items. To start off with, if anyone has any concerns about possibly launching CTI or applying for either the planning grant or the implementation grant.
Jess, earlier in the slide,
Yes.
Bob went over allowable costs, and I guess it's easier to, could you explain any cost that would not be allowed as part of this grant?
One always comes to mind for me, and I think, Bob and I have had conversations about it before. It's the idea of, using the funding for space, like, renting additional space for your training pathway. And, the question comes up of safety, right? There are particular parameters around your space already, and we want to kind of hold to that. Also, we have other grants that have funded space and equipment. And so we try to put that line down on that. That's something that I can think of off the top of my head. But we also do give examples when you'll see the application, you'll see the startup funds to give you a kind of like a little pathway to decide how much or what you could spend money on. But you can always reach out to us, and we do a lot of case by case basis as things are evolving in real time. Tammy, so you're welcome to reach out if there's anything that's on top of mind, and we usually end up hashing it out as a group and deciding thereafter.
Thank you.
I just add to that one component, is capital. Remodeling capital, infrastructure capital is not part of this grant. I will note that we will have out probably early January-ish, without getting myself too far over my skis, that we'll have the FY23 skills capital grants posted. We're probably going to have guidance in the next week. We usually put guidance out around the 15th. Once again, as we did in round 2 last year, programs that are part of CTI get some preference and consideration of funding. So if you are thinking about how do I need to refresh a facility or get updated equipment, then that's your best vehicle for those kind of expenses to impact your current students during the day, but also adult students. So that's coming down the pipe pretty quickly here, Tammy.
That's great, Bob. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. What specific level of commitments are needed from employers? I think the more specific an employer can get with you about their commitment, the better off and the stronger feedback loop you have with those folks. We have employers saying, we would definitely interview 10 of your folks that come out of the program. We have other employers saying, we'll commit at least 2 of our new positions coming up in the fall or spring to your folks to support your initiative. So I think that while there's no set requirement, I think more specificity there is encouraged. Jennifer. Another question, Doreen, can grant funding be used to purchase student uniforms and safety equipment? We have said yes to that in the past, and I think we will continue to do so. I think even with the cost reimbursement model, there's going to be even more leeway in terms of how you spend your $6,000 because it is cost reimbursement per participant. So I think as long as you're meeting those certain thresholds to get those payments, that's within range there.
Yeah, just clarifying personal safety equipment.
Right. Yes.
Just because I work with all of you on other areas, I know that clarity is better. So yeah, personal safety equipment, not capital safety equipment.
Great. Does anyone else have a particular question about any of the information that we provided so far?
Jess.
Yes.
Jared Lucia, Great New Bedford.
Hey, Jared.
Hi, how are you?
Lovely to see you.
Good to see you too. I just wanted to confirm what you said about the employer letters, because what
Yes.
I had my employers state was that basically when they were interested in kind of reviewing like the the curriculum of the program, as well as stating the available opportunities that they had in each trade, whether it was, we're looking at machine technology, so a CNC machinist, manual machinist, marine trades, like any of those, they stated that clearly. And then they also said they'd like to be part of, we'll say, like the employee or candidate evaluation process, like come in, view the program, see the employees working, set up interviews, and then, possibly hire qualified candidates. So that's kind of like the verbiage that they put in their letters. Is that
Oh,
accurate?
that's the ideal scenario, actually, for them to come in and have conversations with those folks and get them hyped up about the training pathways is awesome. So yeah, you are spot on and how you engaged with your employers, Jared.
It was just for anybody else that's doing this, it was actually easy because I picked the companies that we already work with through co-op with the high school. So reaching out, everybody's looking for workers right now. So reaching back out to those co-op employers, it was kind of easy just getting, their interest for an adult education qualified person. Because obviously with co-op, you have a part-time student and they're rotating through, the high school schedule and on and off with academics, and if they're playing sports or whatnot. So they might be there 6 hours a day. So if they can get a full-time person, they were pretty excited about that.
That's awesome. Thank you for that pro tip, Jared.
Yep.
All right, well, we're going to move on to our second question that we're going to post in the universe. What opportunities do you see to increase regional collaboration here and all of the information that we've gone over?
This is Donna Ramus from the Mass Higher Grade New Bedford Workforce Board. Hi, how are you today, Jess? There are some great opportunities to increase regional capacity. But when you talk about the market makers, once we get those people hired, which should be yesterday, they'll be able to get together, and who will bring them together, I'm not sure. Probably the workforce board, and talk about best practices, see what they're doing going out there in the field and getting these employers on board, because we're going to need a lot of employers. I loved everything Jared said about what he's doing with his employers, but I mean, we need hundreds of employers on board. So we definitely got our work cut out for us, and there's huge opportunity everywhere.
That's great, Donna. And yeah, I would love to be a fly on the wall on those convenings, because I think the more that we can coordinate and the more that we know about each other's work, the better off we are about, showing up to this work.
And I should note, I think with schools who have already been 10 schools who've been in process of providing training and the 6 in planning, Jess has done an awesome job of convening them and gathering artifacts. And I think that's something that as time unfolds, we'll be able to provide you things like who's already providing what types of training programs, what credentials, what lengths, not as requirements, but again, as support materials. And since I don't know Jared well, but I will say my experience is the Jareds of the world are pretty good at sharing examples of letters. So maybe some of you could reach out to him, or others. They tend to have good examples. And my experience with employers is they're looking for somebody to share with them what the ask or request is. And then they kind of mirror what you request. So samples of other employer letters have worked well for me in the past. They tend to adopt the majority of it.
Great. Thank you for that, Bob. Are there any additional questions that people may have about the planning grants or the implementation grants that might be lingering?
Jess, this is Larry Martin from Hamden County. I just want to make a comment that, I see this as when we're talking about regional collaboration, one of the gaps that we've seen historically was between the vocational schools, their advisory boards for their individual trades, and the workforce system in general. This is a great opportunity. All the weight does not have to be on the career centers and the market maker and the navigators to get these employers together. Every vocational school that we work with has a great list of employer partners, more times larger than ours. that they work with, and for the employers to be able to see the collaboration between the workforce system and the vocational school system, it's a great opportunity. When I work with at our machine tech program, half the employers that I work with, the schools already work with them and have big connections with them. So this is a great opportunity to demonstrate to the employers that we're integrated into the educational system.
Right. And I think on an infrastructure level, like the commitment is definitely there. And we really want that cohesion. And I think it's just, it's early days in terms of where we are, but I love the idea of where we're going. And I'm really excited about those roles as well, because they're much needed. All right. Well, we're down to the fourth question. Is there anything else that might be in your hearts and minds right now about CTI, where we are and where we're heading?
Again,
All right,
this
I'll
is,
take. Oh, go
Donna
ahead, Donna.
Ramus.
Yep.
So if we don't have questions now, because this is a lot to consume,
Yes.
and we have some, in about an hour or next week or whatever, who can we outreach to?
Well, that's what we're getting ready to hit on in the next few slides. So stay
Very
with me.
good.
But yes.
Very good. Thank you.
Looking ahead to our next steps. Right now, for Mass Hire and schools as they're partnering, I mean, these are the three main things that we want you to be thinking about. Assessing which pathways are the right pathways for you and your VOTEC school, right? Labor market demand, obviously, is a big one. Anticipated timeline of training cohorts. I think, I encourage everyone. I know that there was a lot of dense information. That slide 30, that timeline slide, really come back to that to see, what makes the most sense for your school based on timing. And then again, connecting with relevant employers on the front end. Once we have, some of those, main things hashed out about kind of timelines and what, which training pathways you're thinking of, really starting on the front end with connecting with them so that you have those folks come recruitment time, come outcome time, when you have your folks ready to, start those vocations that they trained for. So again, with employers, hiring timelines, the number of folks they're looking for, the process that they go through, like Jared mentioned, having someone come in and maybe walk through the process with them. I think, a lot of our grantees right now have done really great work with their employer partners who are chomping at the bit to come in and have those conversations. So I think that's, I'm really excited to hear how folks connect there. And then, identifying capacity and approach, I think is where I want to highlight the bulk of this slide, which is program budget and fiscal team capacity. I mean, it's still a labor of love. It's still a lot of work. And we've done, a lot of things to, standardize and streamline and make things a little bit more simple on the invoicing end, but it's still, from start to finish, from RFR submission, to enrollment, to program completion, to outcome. There's a lot of things that happen in between then that you really need to start thinking about. And instructional capacity is actually really huge too. A lot of the schools that struggled getting their training pathways were because of the instructional capacities. They didn't necessarily have, instructors, and then had to delay start dates, and, just very much things to think about on the front end. And we'll be looking for that in applications as well, based on, the data points that we've had from round 1, round 2, and round 3. Marketing and recruitment, again, we're trying to give you, the grant cycle is a big example of that. We're trying to build in that time to give you that outreach capacity to be able to do that, because we know that participant outreach is a huge challenge for a lot of our training pathways. Yeah, and then we go back to, enrolling folks is great, but I really want to focus on the in-between, which is the program completion and the outcome piece. Like, let's start strong and finish strong. And I think having a really good plan for what it looks like to on the placement end and the employer engagement side is throughout. It's not at the end, it's really at the beginning. So I think I'm excited to see applications roll in, see what everybody's thinking. But yeah, if that's the hope there. yeah, so that's basically it. We're just hoping that you'll connect with your partners, that you'll ask us some questions. We have a forum in which to do that, because the RFR will be going out and it'll be live today by end of business day. That's the ideal, just so we have a queue and we'll do first come, first serve in that queue, and then everybody will get the response back, not just you. So ideally you can send your questions there. And the application will also be there at the end of business day today. Oh yes, we can do that for you, Tammy. Happy to do that. I think the more, again, we'll go back to specificity. The more clear you are in the MOU, the stronger everything has worked from the jump. When everybody's clear about what they're doing and what they're not doing, and when they're merging and when they're staying in their lane, I think it's been really helpful to hash that out in the MOU stage. So I'm happy to do that for you, Tammy. Send you a few of the ones that I'm like, this is it. This makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
And
You're
while
welcome.
there is a sample memorandum of agreement in the RFR itself, to Jess's point, you know, we'd much rather see a localized version, you know, with some you know, inspiration from other examples, but don't feel like you need to take the example wholesale. We'd much rather see the you know, that it, you know, customized and that it makes sense for your region.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I just want to add about instructors, because I think Jess really hit on that as you're thinking about your program launch, is your dialogues, for example, that Jared is having or others are having with employers. You know, I found that employer partners can sometimes be either hired as adjuncts or will work in a co-teaching model to give you capacity. And that can be a request of employer partners. Remember, you're after subject matter experts. So a foreman, a supervisor of somebody who is normally in that role. And sometimes employers will give them release time if they're doing training. I think that that's an untapped opportunity. And my experience is if you don't surface it as a need, they don't volunteer it. But if you ask them, they often say, well, let's see if we can figure that out. It's probably a great opportunity to have dialogue with your advisory committees about, you know, kind of a sector or an occupational workforce need and how specifically they can help fill that need. And doing it on the front end to think about, you know, for sustainability, would they be committed to help recruit and participate in identifying instructors? In a couple of cases, I've actually been out in the field, and what I hear is we ended up getting a student that was one of our students at our school 5 years ago, who's now a supervisor at the school, who's now coming to teach our adult program or team teach. So again, I think as you engage your employers, thinking about from a instructor partnering could be very helpful for a portion of the training, particularly for the hands-on instructing.
Do we have any more questions in the sphere today? I think I want to just point out and loop us back around to deadlines. We have, for the planning grants, we have an implementation grant due today, and only for those 6 planning grants that we already had in the pipeline. We have our planning grant, which was out November 15th, and it's due December 15th, so there's still time for that. We also have our implementation grant getting ready to post end of business today, which will be due January 14th. So it gives you about roughly 6 weeks to work on that. Does anybody have any questions about the deadlines or kind of where they fall? Or anything that is—
I had a quick question
Sure.
regarding the recruitment of instructors. And if an organization goes after a grant, can they use a portion of the funding for instructor development for new instructors, especially the industry instructors? Because a lot of times, and we've all seen that just because you know a subject doesn't necessarily mean you could teach a subject.
Right.
And we're not working with traditional students, we're working with adults that come with other challenges. So can a portion of the funding be used in the development, maybe a 2-3 week development program for prospective instructors to get them ready to learn how to teach?
You certainly could take a portion of the budget and use it for onboarding, as you're talking about, Larry.
Okay.
Or you could be doing a situation where you team teach. When it comes to just general teaching methodologies and philosophies and student conflict resolution, understanding how to deliver content, to complement what you can build in your individual budget requests, we are in a discussion with MAVA and DESE about standing up an adult instructor PD program. It's not going to be stood up immediately. It is probably a late spring being stood up. Very similar to what we have in some professional development for our day instructors. So it is something we recognize as a need, but we won't have fully deployed, for example, by January. It would probably be a spring. And we're hoping that it would be a situation where we could figure out how to serve kind of cohorts of interested instructors over a period of time. Again, the value here is looking for subject matter experts who, as you noted, could be informed on how to teach effectively. So I'm hoping there's going to be a both and to that situation in a reasonable timeline.
And I believe there was supposed to be a marketing campaign through CTI for instructor recruitment, so the burden isn't on just the schools and the career centers. Can you elaborate on that, or that's in development as well?
Both, it'll be both parts of that equation, right? We recognize we'll probably be able to do some immediate informational or recruitment through our mass hire centers, for example, looking for instructors. Once we know what the footprint is for CTI, who's interested in planning grants, who's interested in going forward. Ultimately, the goal would be recruitment campaign into a training program into providers. That's the structure we've been talking about.
Okay.
But on the recruitment of instructors, again, as Jess noted, it has been a sticking point. There are some employer associations already, like the Association of Building Contractors, Steve Sullivan, in particular, I talked to a couple of weeks ago, where they're interested in helping either provide instructors or point to instructors. Association of General Contractors, talking with them in the past, I know they've provided, for example, OSHA construction training at times for schools. So I think that there will be some dialogues at a state level of building some modular capacity where we know there's sticky points.
Well, and Larry, I will say, I think in the interim, right, the right now, I think a lot of the grantees who are, are really just kicking butt and taking names out here that's an integral piece of their application. They already have their instructor set or what they're going to do for instruction first and foremost, before building everything else, the curriculum, everything else. They check with their instructors that they have already to see if that capacity is there before putting in that application. And I think, there's a lot to be said for that. I know that we have, different creative solutions for the instructor piece, but I think the strongest that I've seen based on, following these grants from start to finish is that having that piece locked down first.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I should note there's, again, as you're thinking about that continuum of the total instruction, if you're doing career readiness instruction, and that might be an opportunity to subcontract a portion of the experience to your career center if they have an expert who does career advisement, career work readiness types of skill building, and it's a portion of your total hours, then you certainly can partner with another education provider, a community-based organization, your career center. Again, as you look at the total length of the experience, you can modularize it and have different solutions for portions of the 200 or 300 hours.
All right, everyone. Well, that's all I think I have for you today. Bob, I'm going to pass it back to you if you have any final thoughts.
My thoughts are there's a great team at ComCore and certainly our partners at Boston Consulting and the Skills Cabinet who are really eager to support you to be successful. I think we really have learned from you in the last year as we've been developing it. We're making changes based on your feedback. We view this as being partners at the state level to make this work for everybody. I think a couple of key takeaways. One, moving to funding directly capacity in the field for navigators and for market makers will be very helpful. Two, streamlining the reimbursement, moving to a cohort reimbursement model as requested by a number of people. Mary's was on the call. I don't know if she's still on, but Mary and I had a number of talks about how this also aligns to other grants and will be very similar. So if you're doing things like workforce trust fund program grants, this is a very similar process, so it will be consistent for schools. Certainly the move to 6,000 per head count should give people a little bit more budgeting flexibility and the ability to run cohorts of 10. I also think a key to what we've been able to do with the support of the administration and the legislature of being able to have dollars that are multi-year and allowing you as a region and as a provider and partners to be thinking about this over a continuum of time. I know we all on this call have at times had to play the roulette game to a certain extent of having access to available resources. This is a time where multi-year planning and multi-year requests are going to be efficient and effective in your strategy. And it's something I hope that you will take advantage of. These grants can be pretty sizable. These could be 200, 300, 400, 600, up to 600,000 per an individual provider over some period of time. So you really can start thinking strategically. And then the last part that somebody asked at the very beginning is we really felt that the startup funds, which was information we heard from the original 5 that became 10, we really felt like that was an important step of being able to put the $40,000 out in early implementation startup to make sure that you have, in particular, staff for coordinating at the school level and supporting an individual to help build scale to these programs. So I know we're a little over. We really appreciate your time. We're from the government. We're here to help. We really think this is a great opportunity, and we want people to take advantage of it because we want to continue to advocate for resources if there's a demand from the field. So appreciate everybody's time. And if I don't run across you in the next couple of weeks, we wish you a great holiday season, and I look forward to reading all of your grant applications. Anything else? I guess I'll do this as the end of the Zoom meeting, right?
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.